All right, rejoining us, and it's been quite some time, is channel favorite, Dr. Justin Bronk. Justin, it is great to see you. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Let's talk about your travels, because you've been a lot of different places since we last spoke, and you've also had some flight ops, and this will sort of feed our discussion about the Ukrainian Air War. But talk to us about where you've been and what militaries you've had access to and what airplanes you've flown.
So in terms of flying stuff the last 3 or 4 months, flew with the US Air Force at Spangalum in Germany. July, flew with the Italians on Eurofighter in Gioia del Colle. Recently flew with the Luftwaffe at Növenich in Western Germany, again on Eurofighter. It's been interesting from seeing how different air forces actually do the business day to day, and particularly the contrast in the way the kind of the crew room looks and feels, and the way people brief, and even kind of intangible stuff like what's on the walls, what stories do the instructors sort of tell, little anecdotes. Do they tell little anecdotes? How are the kind of sorties framed? How are discussions framed? Are people looking at the more at the flight safety aspect, obviously omnipresent, but how much is that stressed versus tactical aspects, how you're taking your shots, how your deconfliction, how your communications pattern, all of that stuff, versus how do people frame it in the operational output terms. How much emphasis is there on the mission, and I guess why that is important.
One of the topics that we've tackled, which was a function of a paper that you wrote at RUSI, was whether NATO is training properly for the next fight. So what is your sense after seeing all of these different NATO air forces up close?
The very strong sense I get is that the fundamentals are still excellent, in the sense that a lot of the procedures at the underlying day-to-day ops, and the way that planning and briefing and step fly, debrief, shot val, all of that stuff is done, is still extremely impressive, almost universally. But that the combination of, in many cases, practical restrictions, there's more so for some countries than others, but things like airspace, how much space do you actually have to train in? Therefore, what tactics can you train to in live environments? Do you have access to threat emitters? Do you have access to live weapon ranges? That kind of thing is very, very variable. And for a lot of air forces, it's very challenging, actually, with the those sort of restrictions, and also in some cases, like particularly the RAF and the US Air Force, just the tempo in terms of constant deployments and constant ops that they have to run, means that trying to stay really good at, or get really good at, and then stay really good at, keep that currency up with skills, all the different mission sets they're theoretically liable for, is really, really challenging.
This episode is sponsored by Ridge's new Hyper Lime collection. The Hyper Lime collection is inspired by the fluorescent shades found in high-performance gear, a hue that speaks volumes yet serves a purpose. Like the color found in key places around an aircraft carrier's flight deck, this dynamic yellow plays an essential role in peak performance. The Ridge wallet is the last wallet you will ever need. It expands to hold up to 12 cards, plus room for cash, all while remaining as slim as possible, unlike those bulky old dad wallets. The Ridge is designed with RFID blocking materials that protects you from digital pickpocketers. It's scratch resistant. There's an optional AirTag attachment, so you'll never have to lose your wallet again. The Ridge key case holds up to 6 keys and prevents them from jingling. You get up to 30% off your order when buying the Ridge wallet and the key case together. Shop the holiday sale by going to ridge.com/WardCarroll and get up to 30% off through December 20th. That's ridge.com/WardCarroll. And if you use my link, enter your email or SMS for a free chance to win a Ridge bundle worth $4,000. No purchase necessary.
For a lot of countries, while they might have multi-role fighters, and most people do, most fleets are nominally committed to a lot of different mission sets. Actually, there is not much depth of expertise in a lot of the force in a lot of those mission sets, just because people have to stay across so many different skills, and also in many cases do all these deployments, that some stuff is just really hard to deal with. And you see an interesting contrast between experienced patch wearers, so weapons instructors, particularly people who have 10, 15 years on fast jets, who have flown in a period where they had a lot more flying, and in some cases fewer task sets. Their perspective is very different to the more junior instructor pilots and junior pilots, who typically in most air forces feel fairly capable. You ask them, and because how ready do you feel for this, and this? And the general answer varies. But for example, in the US Air Force, generally, no, we feel pretty good at the end of each 4-month phased work up to whatever the primary, let's say defensive counter-air as an entire mission set or offensive counter-air. We feel pretty good. And you talk to those patch wearers, and often the perspective is, no, they feel good because they've never really been good. So they don't actually know what really being on top of the game looks and supposed to look and feel like. To my mind, it would make sense for a lot of, particularly the smaller NATO air forces, where you're having to spread a lot of those intangible day-to-day frictions, so aircraft availability, airspace restrictions, training serials falling out, weather disruption. You're having to spread those out over a much smaller force, and therefore you have disproportionate impacts in an unpredictable way. I think it would make sense for a lot of those air forces to focus on fewer mission sets, but doing those mission sets better. The issue is, of course, no one air force can essentially deprioritize certain mission sets unless they're very confident that one of their nearby allies is going to really focus on doing that credibly and will show up and resource that mission set. So there's a bit of a first mover problem. Quite a few air forces, I think, would quite like to specialize. They understand the challenges, but it's difficult for somebody to go first.
So in the most general sense, do these air forces seem professional and motivated?
Professional, yes. Motivated, it very much varies by nation. For example, it was quite noticeable that there was a lot more of a kind of cynical outlook from a lot of the German pilots I spoke to on squadron, particularly the more junior ones, who basically didn't see much route or much prospect of getting much more serious in terms of their operational output. Being able to carry live weapons a lot more, to do much more flexible use of airspace, to train in a more realistic fashion because of the political constraints. It's not really the Luftwaffe's fault, but because of the political constraints that the German system puts on the military in Germany, there was, I think, a bit of a suppressive effect on morale there. They're still very professional, and in many cases still seem to really enjoy the work, and they clearly work very hard. But I think there's a significant degree of cynicism there in terms of, but we're kind of just going through the motions a lot of the time. Whereas in Sweden, for example, really pretty high morale. People look and feel pretty focused. That's partly because they have a very stable system. So when you join a Swedish fighter wing as a junior pilot just out of flight training, you are expected to be there for 20, 25 years. And so, you will stay in that wing. You might move between the two squadrons in the wing, but generally you'll stay in that wing, put down roots there, and just really focus on slowly and intensively growing into that really complex, dispersed operations model for your primary air-to-air mission set and whatever the secondary mission set is for that wing. And that gives people, I think, a sense of focus and a sense of credibility, particularly now that there's more money going into defense in Sweden. Canada, there's significant limitations for people's morale in terms of they're having real struggles with maintaining their really old F-18s because of the length of time it took to get a political decision to actually buy the F-35. They got lost kind of 10 years, and so that fleet is having to go much longer than it was envisaged. And that brings a lot of issues and a lot of challenges, and means that because of the inherent limitations of a legacy Hornet, and to a degree some procedural issues and some limitations in terms of equipment, weaponry, airspace, training opportunities, there is some cynicism, for example, in that fighter community, that they don't feel that they're actually really capable in a lot of the mission sets that they're liable for. But in that case, it doesn't seem to impact the commitment to want to do the job and to be professional. It's just kind of leads to everyone being really cynical and retirement rates being quite high, particularly among instructors, because you can kind of deal with that frustration up to a certain point, but then you kind of hit major level and you get a lot more retirements than is ideal. And the US Air Force, people are professional, cheerful, motivated. But of course, compared to any other NATO Air Force, there's just so much resource pumped into that machine that, of course they are. They generally don't fly a massive amount more than a lot of NATO partners, in some cases less than, for example, the Italians and the Germans seem to fly a bit more than your average USAF fighter wing. But the quality of those sorties in the USAF is often much higher in terms of the training value because they can put much larger formations up with tankers and other enablers much more frequently and train with more weapons releases and go to more exercises and do more deployments. And so there's less of the either what's this for or the we're just so behind the drag curve feeling that in some air forces gets people down.
So let's pivot to a discussion about the war in Ukraine. So you mentioned USAFE. Normally, we would talk about the Carrier Air Wing and the Carrier Strike Group. Currently, Ford has been sortied to Eastern Med since October 7th. In fact, they were just extended by the Secretary of Defense, Austin, for a second time. So they're focused over there. We've done a few episodes on the channel about the Ike's Carrier Strike Group doing dual carrier ops for a brief period of time and then sortying to the Persian Gulf. So there's a lot of U.S. Navy focus around the Israel-Hamas war, little to none around the war in Ukraine currently. But Secretary Austin just made a surprise visit to Kyiv, and during the course of that visit, he promised another $100 million of aid. And we'll talk about your concerns about U.S. congressional aid over the long haul. Obviously, $100 million seems like a big number, but it's not really. In fact, you tweeted something a couple of days ago that's a pretty amazing statement. It said, the lesson of the Ukraine war is the amount of munitions you burn through. Quote, think of a ludicrous number, double it, add a zero, and you're still not there. End quote. And this is official under Chatham House rules. It seems like a bit of hyperbole, but it's not really. So the demand is ongoing. As we always do, let's put up the ISW ground map, and it looks to my eye unchanged. I'm sure there are details you're aware of that make it other than that, particularly the air war. But let's talk about the air war, and let's start with where are we with providing F-16s to the Ukrainian Air Force?
There are now Ukrainian pilots training on F-16 in a number of countries, especially in Europe. And the arrangements for moving surplus, for example, Danish F-16s as they're decommissioned and modified to make them suitable for transfer, moving them across, I believe the first couple came to Romania last week. So that process is ongoing. As we've kind of touched on before, in some ways this is the easy bit because converting pilots who are already current or at least have previously been current on MiG-29, Su-27, so what Ukraine has been flying up to now, onto F-16 in terms of flying it safely and operating at a relatively basic level in key mission sets, that can be done in a matter of a few months. It depends how many corners you want to cut off the normal conversion course, but it's manifest, of course, from how you support those on the ground in Ukraine in a posture such that it's not going to be easily located and then destroyed on the ground by Russian ballistic missile strikes. You can't kind of air defense your way out of that problem. It's more going to be, as the Ukrainian Air Force have been doing up to now, dispersal around the country and dispersal on bases as well. So using lots of different bits of bases and using as many bases as possible, including forward landing and refueling points, because it's a big country. And if you're especially at low level, jets will run out of legs pretty quickly. So you typically land and refuel forward. There have been a couple of losses that have been seen in public of Ukrainian jets being hit by loitering munitions, Lancet 3s, on some of those forward refueling points because they have to be much closer to the front lines than the bases further back. All of this is difficult to do with an F-16. It's not impossible, but because you have to prepare surfaces and then keep surfaces to a very high standard for F-16, and potentially in some cases extend runways, and taxiways all have to be the same standard. So if you're trying to disperse on a large base, you need to keep all the taxiways to the required surface standard and FOD cleared status. That's quite a visible set of activities. There'll be a lot of people involved, and it's a lot of work, and you'll see it probably from orbital observation. So to avoid being tracked and struck easily by the Russians with long-range fires, you will have to prepare a lot of locations to that standard, and that's a very resource and people-intensive thing to do. I suspect it will take at least another year or so, probably a little longer, but we'll see. It partly, of course, depends on what the US administration, both this one and whatever happens in November, decides to do, because the current American policy is no American boots on the ground of any sort in Ukraine, unlike the UK and some other countries in Europe. So US contractors, which have been a huge part of every other previous F-16 foreign stand-up of foreign air forces with US enablement, would currently not really work unless the administration changes that policy. The other thing is the tactics, right? So you can convert a pilot to an F-16 or another jet in a few months. But what you're doing is creating a bad wingman, in the sense of an inexperienced wingman. And when you look at how fighter tactics work, typically you in a USAF squadron, you'd be looking at a two-ship upgrade. So you could be the leader of a two-ship formation, a basic pair, after maybe your first year if you're really good, but that's with all the enablers and having done a full conversion course, and under supervision within a big squadron that's got lots of patches and all of that stuff. And usually midway through your second year as combat ready. And then to be a four-ship lead, so to actually lead and brief and kind of manage most of the tactics for any high-threat environment in an F-16 or any other jet, you need a four-ship lead. Well, four-ship leads at minimum take 3 years to grow under the best circumstances. A lot of the time it's 5 to 6 years before you get people to the stage where they can go through their FLUG for flight lead upgrade course. It's going to, even if you were to truncate that a lot, it's going to take a while to get Ukrainian pilots up to that standard, because Ukrainian Air Force, like the Russian Air Force, doesn't really and hasn't really flown two-ship and certainly four-ship tactics as a standard thing the way that Western Air Forces have done. It's just not really in their doctrine. They might fly in larger formations with mutual support, but they're not flying tactically as a four-ship, as a standard thing. And so, they will have to learn a lot of that from scratch in order to be effective with what is a 1970s airframe in an incredibly high-threat environment. Now, of course, I'm sure the Ukrainian perspective is, look, we know how to fly in a war zone. We've been doing it for a year and a half. You guys have nothing to teach us on that. The issue with that is not that they're wrong in the sense that they know their tactics way better than we ever could. It's just that F-16 is not designed for their tactics, nor are the weapons that it might be supplied with. And so just employing them as they've been employing MiG-29 or Su-27 is not likely to give you a really particularly significant increase in combat effectiveness. Yes, there will be marginal increases in some places. Yes, it will be compatible with more weapons, but you're talking about a small number of airplanes that for a huge amount of money. So to really leverage that capability, you're going to need to train people up to be capable of executing tactics that require significantly more aircraft in one place at one time with a more flexible air-centric way of commanding and controlling it. Because the other thing is, the Ukrainian Air Force is a former Soviet lineaged and doctrine-oriented air force like the Russians. And so air operations are, broadly speaking, coordinated by ground forces. They are tasked by ground forces. In some ways, it's joint operations. But that's not the way we do air in the West. And we've seen some of the limitations of what happens where we've tried to port Western training with very truncated time and resource across from things like armor to Ukrainian forces training on that Western armor. Their tactics, unmodified, aren't the best way to use that stuff, but equally we don't have time, or we didn't have time there at least, with the case of tanks, to really train them across the way we would train to use armor, and therefore they can't employ it that way. Air is much more difficult than armor.
Let me bring up the box score that's published by the Ukrainian government, and you can see 323 aircraft. The personnel casualties number is almost 320,000 Russian soldiers killed. But that's a lot of airplanes. Obviously, that's a lot of soldiers, but that's a lot of airplanes, right? So we would think that they've been able to mitigate the air threat. Yet it appears from some of the footage that we're seeing on social media that they still have local air superiority in some areas of eastern Ukraine where they can take out a railroad bridge or they can attack unmolested. So it leads me to wonder, okay, you've framed the issue in terms of distributed basing is part of the requirement. So you got to figure out the logistics piece. We're working on the training piece. So we solve this, let's say 6 months time, boom, you have how many F-16s do we think they're going to have ultimately? 120 or so? I mean, what is the number going to look like once we're all said and done here?
Ballpark 200.
Okay, so 200, let's just say 200 airplanes. So first question is, once it's all in place, what effect is that going to have in the air war / the war? And what else should they be provided against the backdrop of political realities in terms of type model series like Gripen, Typhoon, Legacy Hornets?
So the Ukrainian numbers in terms of the claim casualty count that board you put up, it's interesting because some of it is not massively unrealistic. Actually, the total casualty claims in terms of personnel, if you count wounded, not just seriously wounded and killed, but also wounded in general who are recoverable, then 320,000 is not massively off. A lot of fairly grounded projections and estimates. But the 323 airplanes is just manifestly way off in terms of any sort of confirmed or attributable losses, which it's actually, there are plenty of ways of cross-referencing and looking for fast jet losses. Like, it's not that hard. We're in the low 80s. Now that's a significant number of airplanes to have lost for the Russians. But what the Ukrainian claims, it's I understand that there is an information operations dimension to a lot of this stuff. They started off with significantly inflated claims early on. Partly, there are always overinflated claims air to air in the war. And of course, the Russian claims are enormously inflated as well. But I think there was a perception that the Ukrainians couldn't have started with these big totals and then suddenly either reduce them to something more realistic or stop kind of adding to them, because then there would be a perception of, well, we were effective at first, but now we're not. What happened? But now they've been overinflated to a point where if you took those claims at face value, there's nothing left of the Russian Air Force, practically speaking. The Russian Air Force, you see numbers like 1,700 fast jets, not in any meaningful sense. The Russian Air Force entered the war with somewhere in the region of 450 modern fast jets, by which I mean Su-27 and SM-3s, so the most modern but ancient still Su-27s, Su-30 SM and SM-2, Su-34, and Su-35S, plus a small number, about 120 modernized SM and SM-3 series Su-25s, and the MiG-31 BM and BSM, interceptors that have been thoroughly overhauled and modernized. That's kind of the force they had going into it. And so, if they'd lost 323 jets, well, they'd have almost nothing left. So it's almost got to a point where that information operations-led tally has actually, in the aircraft space at least, become quite self-defeating, because it undermines the seriousness of their requests for air defense assets and fighters, which they do need. 200 F-16s, if they had the requisite weapons and tactics, would be a formidable basis for a formidable air defense capability, assuming you could protect them on their bases. Of course, ironically enough, the more aircraft you give them, the harder it is to disperse them sufficiently to avoid losing significant numbers on the ground to Russian missile strikes, because you're trying to disperse a much larger number of aircraft and support personnel and ground support equipment, and hide the patterns of a much larger pattern of air activity. 200 F-16s or anything like it is going to take many, many years, if nothing else, because it's far more money than Ukraine has to throw at these problems at the moment. Then they may not be paying for the aircraft, but because they're surplus donations, but they cost a lot to run. You look at a country like the Netherlands, which is a rich country with very high-tech stuff that's been operating these things for years, and they have a fleet of around, I think, just shy of 100 F-16s as a sort of steady state. These are expensive assets. So, the ambition is one thing. I think F-16 is undeniably going to be, and should be, at least a major part of the backbone of the Ukrainian Air Force in the medium to long term. The question of how many go forward, how quickly, and with what weapons and what tactics and what level of pilot training and what level of enablement and basing posture is a separate one, and that's about what can this do for the war in the foreseeable short-term future. That, I think, is much more questionable at the moment. For other things, the only other thing that makes any sense is Gripen. Typhoon, it's not designed for that posture, much like F-16, and it's more expensive to fly and operate. And unless you were supplying modern ones with Meteor, which nobody's suggesting supplying, even talking about supplying, A, Ukraine can't afford them, B, to operate or run them, and B, it doesn't really bring anything that an F-16 wouldn't bring, because the real strength of Typhoon is really high, really fast, lobbing missiles over insane distances with all of that stored gravitational and kinetic energy at launch. Typhoon's, it's like an F-15C. It's on steroids, but it's designed to go high and fast and lob AMRAAMs, fundamentally, with a big radar. And that is something that is only really possible if you're not in a high threat, long range SAM engagement zone. So it relies on other people doing that SIAD-DIAD task. It's a very capable platform as part of a wider mix, but it's not something that would, fundamentally change the game in Ukraine, and would be more difficult than F-16, as would Rafale or most of the other things that have been discussed. There's two reasons why Gripen is particularly sensible as a second option alongside, not instead of, F-16. Gripen, it's easier to base, designed to be maintained by conscript teams with one senior mechanic and 5 conscripts. So the conscripts could be Ukrainian trainees with 2 or 3 months training, exactly as the conscripts in Sweden have 2 or 3 months training before they work on the jet. You would still need contractors to be that one supervisor, but for F-16 you'd need far more contractors. But also on the tactical side of it, because Gripen is Meteor capable, assuming you could get Meteor, but that is provision of Meteor is asking European countries to trade off effectiveness against Russia in the long term, i.e. compromise of the weapon over time, versus effectiveness against Russia now. Whereas asking for the latest AMRAAMs from the US is asking the US to trade off effectiveness against China in the medium and long term versus a slight trade-off in security, effectiveness against Russia now in Ukraine. So the latter, I just doubt is going to happen. I'd be very pleasantly surprised for Ukraine, at least, if they did supply something like Charlie 8 or Delta 3, the later versions of AMRAAM with the longer ranges, but I doubt it.
So what are they going to get then? Just the older versions of AMRAAM, or just Sidewinders? What are their air-to-air munitions going to be?
If I had to guess, I would guess early Charlies.
Okay.
Charlie 3, Charlie 5.
That makes sense.
Because they're using NASAMS, which uses AMRAAM. So the NASAMS is one of the SAM systems, medium-range SAM systems that's been sent to Ukraine, and it's working very well against cruise missiles and things. That typically is firing B or early C model AMRAAMs, or some of the older A ones in some people's service. But if you look at what nations who've supplied NASAMS to Ukraine typically assign as weapon stocks, it would be a fair guess that Ukraine is using B and A, B, and possibly very early C model AMRAAMs. I suspect B models. Because there's a lot of surplus B models around. They've come to the end of their airframe carriage lives, so air forces will otherwise have to pay to throw them away. Meteor, it's not only that it has the advantage for Gripen of having access to Meteor in a way that F-16 doesn't, is a massively longer stick. So it is, because it has power throughout the flight envelope instead of just the initial boost of the rocket motor. So it's got ramjet propulsion, which means it has power throughout the envelope, including in terminal phase. First of all, the no escape zone, the range at which you cannot just outmaneuver the missile and run it out of energy. It's called the no escape zone, or missile abort range, is massively larger than AMRAAM at any range. But particularly if you're firing low and relatively slow, because you're having to stay under a surface-to-air missile threat envelope, which is why the Ukrainians fly low all the time. If you're having to fly low and your target is quite high up, that power throughout the envelope means the impact on your effective range is massively less for Meteor than it is for AMRAAM, or something like the Russian R-77, or the R-27s that the Ukrainians have at the moment. So because of that additional range, from a tactical point of view, the tactics that you would need if you were flying Gripens in Ukraine are much less sophisticated and therefore easier to learn and easier to fly in small numbers. So 2 ships, for example, or even singletons, as opposed to AMRAAM and F-16, where to fight your way in and suppress your way in to get to the front lines, with that, with fighter caps lobbing AA-13 R-37s at you and all of those, that SAM threat as well. To fight your way in, you need mutually supporting tactics with a lot of airplanes, with a lot of suppressive munitions, whether it be air-to-air, AMRAAMs or HARM or whatever. A, that's a very expensive way of doing things. B, it's very complicated and it takes a lot of time to train people to the stage where they can reliably execute that, especially under the extreme stress of actually being shot at. So yeah, you could have a much greater impact with small numbers of Gripens than you could with small numbers of F-16s, and they'd be easier to support. There are efforts ongoing in that area. It's not a dead deal, and it's been announced publicly that that there are Ukrainian pilots going to evaluate and train on Gripens.
So let's pull up to 30,000 feet and talk about how this plays out at the macro level. Something I always ask you at the end of our conversations is, how much longer? What is Putin's off-ramp? These kinds of questions. So the existence of the Israel-Hamas conflict have not changed the calculus with respect to the threat of Russia going through Ukraine and the threat that poses particularly to Western Europe, not to mention NATO/United States. Would you agree with that?
Well, certainly Israel-Palestine, Israel-Hamas has not changed the threat calculus or particularly the trajectory at the moment. What it's done so far, so the IDF has been relying pretty heavily on air-delivered firepower over artillery-delivered firepower in Gaza so far, compared to previous rounds, as awful as that sounds. That means that there has been less of a conflicting demand for 155mm howitzer shells for the most part, which is Ukraine's most pressing, most key requirement. This is an artillery war in Ukraine. 80% or so of the casualties on both sides throughout the war and to this point are being caused by artillery. So the supply of artillery rounds is the key factor on the sustainability and effectiveness of Ukrainian operations and Russian operations. So far, the diversion of 155 supplies to Israel has not had a significant effect on the Ukraine supply equation. That could change if the war develops into a wider regional war. So, for example, if a third intifada is declared in the West Bank, and that brings in Hezbollah, or if Hezbollah joins in directly from Lebanon. So far, they appear to have been held back, deterred, chosen not to enter, take your pick. Certainly 2 aircraft carrier groups nearby probably doesn't hurt in that respect. But what has happened so far is it has taken all of the policy focus away from how do we make the support to Ukraine sustainable, which had been a key question in Europe and in the US. So it has had a significant impact and continues to have a significant impact in terms of distracting policy attention at a key moment. Because going into the winter, the basic issue is that the rate at which Ukrainian forces have been firing artillery ammunition to successfully, albeit in a costly and slow way, grind their way forward and take ground. They have taken ground, not enough, and they didn't achieve their objectives this summer. But they have certainly ground forward. They've caused massive attrition on Russian forces, as well as taking significant losses themselves. They've ground their way forward. That rate of artillery ammunition consumption, both in terms of shells and barrels, is not currently sustainable. The US has put significant investment, and they did it last year, into expanding ammunition production of key ammunition natures, so both 155, also things like joint JASSM, so air-launched cruise missiles, and a whole range of other things. But that it takes time for that to show, and the US is facing a lot of competing demands for that ammunition. They have to keep allies like Israel, South Korea, Taiwan supplied and building up, especially in the case of Taiwan, ammunition stocks to try and deter, keep deterrence around, because it's so much cheaper to deter a war than it is to actually fight it once it starts. So they're trying to maintain the deterrent posture, particularly against China, while at the same time keeping Ukraine supplied with enough to keep going effectively. Europe has, broadly speaking, been supplying from either its own stockpiles, which is the right call when the instruction is get stuff there as fast as possible in quantity with the money provided here in these, this supply tranche or whatever. And it's a result of this constant thing of each new tranche of aid for Ukraine being negotiated and decided on in a relatively short time period to cover a relatively short time period, rather than looking at it as a planning assumption for this is going to run long. Therefore, we need a sustainable strategy that makes this work longer term. Because if you're looking at it that way, what you want to do is do what the US did last year, which is invest in significantly increased domestic supply capability of shells and barrels and vehicles and all of this stuff, spare parts. Which in many ways is much better for our own economies as well, because then, you're not, the US, for example, investing all this money in ammunition production is not giving that money to Ukraine or anybody else. It's investing it in jobs in the US, skilled jobs producing munitions and missiles and vehicles and all these sort of high-end skilled manufacturing jobs. It's exactly what the US economy wants and exactly what a lot of people in those states want. It's quite interesting to me that this is not more prevalent in the political policy discussion of, no, look, this isn't these dollar amounts, we're not giving them away. We're spending them on our own stuff in our own factories for our own people's jobs. So in some ways, that investment package is actually easier to sell to electorates, or ought to be, than buying stuff on the open market, as the UK, for example, has done a lot of, or giving away stock, although giving away stock doesn't really immediately impact in-year spending, so it doesn't really impact on what countries can spend on schools and hospitals and whatever, until the stocks get low enough that you have to start actually replacing things. So Europe needs to move forward. That there is movement. There is work on this. For example, the EU is trying to move forward on a large scale common ammunition purchasing and manufacturing agreement. The logic being that rather than each individual country going to industry and saying we need X 100,000 shells, but it's a one-off order, to which industry, it's not really in their interest to invest loads of money to meet that order instantly or as fast as possible, if that order is not going to be replicated, because then they have a load of spare capacity lying around, spare jobs, spare manufacturing capacity that they then potentially don't have a use for. Whereas if you get lots of European countries to order collectively, you can say, first of all, it's not 100,000 shells or whatever, it's 12 million shells. Oh, and by the way, it's 12 million shells with 6 million a year from then on, because this is how much we expect Ukraine will need and to refill stockpiles in Europe collectively. But it's just taking so much time because so many people have to agree. And the danger is that as we go through the winter, because the supply of shells is likely to get less, because it's difficult to sustain the rate that we've been supplying at, if the Ukrainians are firing fewer shells, and 80% of the casualties are caused by artillery, then the Russian casualty rate will drop. And if you strip all the morality and all the other nuance out of it, the basic equation on how this goes next year is, can the Ukrainians keep killing and maiming enough Russians to mean that most people who are mobilized in each 6-month round of conscription have to be fed directly into the front lines with limited training in order to fill the gaps. And as long as that keeps happening, which it has done for the last year and a bit, it's very difficult for the Russians to regenerate large-scale offensive formations. So to do defensive warfare, you just need bodies and trenches, pretty much. To do offensive warfare, you need large formed units at brigade scale, at least, that can maneuver with armor and electronic warfare and UAV support and infantry and armored personnel carriers and all of this stuff and logistics. And it takes time to train both soldiers to operate like that and staffs to run them. The Ukrainians are finding it difficult to train people to operate at that scale, partly because their training areas are within range of missile strikes. And the Russians are finding it hard because the casualty rate is so high that they're having to just feed people in too quickly. So if the Ukrainians can keep the casualty rate high, then they can probably retain the initiative through into spring, and then it's easier to keep up the political case for continuing to supply them. Yes, it's a grind, but it's the right thing to do, and it is in our own security interests, so we'll keep doing it. If they're not, and the Russians are able to essentially seize the initiative going into the spring because we didn't put the right industrial investments in place now to allow us to dig deeper in our own stocks to keep them supplied, because the Russians can't pose a direct threat to us in Europe as long as they're pinned down in Ukraine. So if we have made those investments and we know that in 18 months to 2 years, we're going to get X number of shells coming through to replenish our own stocks, we know we've got resupply, therefore we can dig deeper into our stockpiles. If we don't know that resupply, where it's coming from or when, then it's much harder to dig any deeper. And so if those decisions aren't made, now the Russians get the initiative, at which point, then there's a much more difficult trade-off for European countries in particular, because then the trade-off is not, the discussion is not how do we keep Ukraine supplied sufficiently to continue its war successfully. The discussion becomes instead, can we give the Ukrainians enough to stabilize things, or do we have to prioritize refilling our own depleted stockpiles because all of a sudden we feel very vulnerable ourselves? Where things go is really up to European countries this winter. If we continue to look at this as a short-term, month-to-month thing, then I worry the investments aren't going to be made right. And so, the key messages I would say, from a political perspective, politicians need to understand that this is going to run long. And if they don't keep up the supply, then it's going to run long, but in a much more dangerous way that will ultimately require us to spend far more money defending ourselves against a much more dangerous Russian posture, an emboldened one at that. But therefore, since it's going to run long, A, the investments just need to be made in production, not trying to buy stuff elsewhere. And B, make the case to the politicians need to make the case to their voters to say, this is not money that's being sent overseas. This is money that we're proposing to spend at scale on massive development of industrial skilled factory jobs, often in really deprived areas of our own countries, because that's generally where munitions factories are, is in really deprived areas. So, given how much nations borrow, tens of billions when it suits them, to pump into economic stimulus packages, whether it be COVID recovery or leveling up agendas or whatever it happens to be, use the same logic, use the same sources of funding to pump money into production in our own countries. Because apart from anything else, the countries that do that, the world is looking pretty dangerous for the next 3 to 5 years at least. China threat isn't going away. It's accelerating faster than we hoped or feared. You look at the latest congressional report on the Chinese military modernization. It's just bad news on bad news in terms of this is ahead of schedule. This is bigger than we thought. This is ahead of schedule. So the US is going to be tied up in the Indo-Pacific for the foreseeable, which means Europe isn't going to be reinforced at scale if something happens concurrently with a crisis in the Indo-Pacific in Europe with the Russians, which means the Russians have an incentive to do something if there's a crisis in the Pacific. And the Russians are on a war economy footing now. They were at a low point at the beginning of this year, but they've turned a corner, unfortunately. Missile production is massively up. Artillery production is massively up. They're producing nearly twice what they produced last year this year. They're spending a load of money, about 4.5% of their GDP on defense at the moment. And they just approved a spending increase of 68% on this year's figures for next year. They've got ammunition supply set up, new manufacturing capacity set up for them in North Korea, in Iran, in a couple of the stans. So they've also diversified supply. The Russians are kind of gearing up for a long, grinding war. And so the other thing is, if we don't invest in making our not just Ukrainian consumption rates sustainable to enable Ukraine to keep grinding forward and potentially win, but also to refill our own stocks, the danger is we get to a point in 2 to 3 years' time with the US tied up in the Indo-Pacific where Europe suddenly has very little. And at that point, you would have a rearmed Russia, a very embittered Russia, a very battle-hardened Russia, and suddenly a very vulnerable Europe. And so, without wanting to sound too alarmist, too much of the defense discussion in Europe and in the UK is treated politically and in public as a sort of inconvenient distraction. Yeah, of course, well, we kind of have to keep supporting the Ukrainians because it's the right thing to do, but it's all very expensive. And how long can we keep this up? And it's difficult. And but there's a lot of other things, there's health and, but the NHS is falling apart and all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, it is inconvenient. It is expensive. It is difficult. But sadly, the enemy's made that decision for you. It isn't a game. And I would much rather be accused of being a bit overzealous in pointing out the very obvious trend signal of threat now and get to a position in 2 to 3 years' time where if nothing happens, people go, see, we're way too concerned about that, than the alternative, which is people continuing to treat it as an optional, difficult, short-term thing that we just manage rather than plan against, and suddenly coming in a year and a half or 2 years' time and going, oh God, this is actually a real problem. And all our solutions are still 3 years away if we pull the lever now, because it takes 2 to 3 years to do anything in defense.
Yeah, I mean, history would suggest that your logic is right on. A few things based on what you said. So let me bring up the box score again. So we're talking about this attrition over the next year and what it would take for Putin to be convinced that it's not worth pursuing. So just, again, that number, 320,000 casualties. That's just a number that Americans aren't familiar with domestically. And so if that amount of attrition isn't causing Putin to figure out an exit strategy, I'm not sure what it's going to take in the future. That's part A. Part B is there have been calls, as we show that ISW map, which in general looks unchanged for the most part, right? It's the Donbass, it's the land bridge just shy of Odessa, right? That's how it's been since, let's just say, summer of 2022, with some perturbations back and forth that we've discussed in detail. All right, so critics, particularly on one side of the aisle in the United States, are suggesting just cede that part and then we'll declare peace. And that's just the cost of being Ukraine, being the shield of Europe. You should have seen this coming. These people are Russian anyway. The separatists speak Russian and not Ukrainian. All of these other dumbed down logic that ignores the reality on the ground there. And it certainly ignores the will and the resolve of the Zelensky administration. To wit, they just republished the Ukrainian peace plan and redoubled their commitment to it. And so some of the high points of this 10-point peace plan are pretty concerning with respect to ending the war, let's just say, right? So the low-hanging fruit, they want radiation and nuclear safety. Basically, the way it says is no one has a right to blackmail the world with a radioactive disaster. Russia is not an exemption. They try to be, and they attempt to rattle their nuclear arsenal. This nuclear blackmail has to stop. They're talking about Zaporizhzhia, where it's manned by Russian troops. They're like, give it back to us and stop doing that sort of thing. They're talking about food security, which is the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and how this is going to affect the whole world. Obviously, this is revenue for Ukraine. And as long as that blockade is happening, there's not revenue. And there's also their claim is that it's hurting countries in Asia, Africa, and Europe. Energy security. They're talking about the Russians attacking power grids, which is just War 101, but they want them to stop doing that. Release of all prisoners and deportees, including all of the Ukrainian kids that were taken to Russia for basically re-education camps. So all of that. Number 5 of the 10 is the longest pole in the tent, let's just say, which is implementation of the UN Charter and restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity and the world order. Okay, so as long as the Zelensky administration is committed to that as part of the peace plan, then they're going to have to oust not just the Russians from the Donbass and the separatist regions, but also Crimea. They want Crimea back. When the world didn't pay attention in 2014, that's part of their goal for the end state. So things like 6 through 10 are just an after effect of a cessation of hostilities, which is withdrawal of Russian troops. They want justice for the war crimes. Mariupol comes to mind. They want immediate protection of the environment. They also, as you've said, whatever we have as an end state, and this is prescriptive for Israel, Palestine / Hamas, which is how do we guarantee a steady state, a status quo that doesn't like have these tripwires where it goes hot again easily. And part of that is they want a confirmation of the end of the war, which means Russia would have to admit they lost, more or less. So that is the Ukrainian peace plan that it was published shortly after the war started, but they've just republished to say these are still our, not demands, but these are our mission objectives for this war. So, okay, 2 things. Putin is not deterred by having over 300,000 soldiers killed and with no end in sight in terms of that casualty rate. In fact, it'll probably get worse as the munitions pour in, as we discussed in great detail in the first part of this episode. And then part B is the Zelensky government, arguably laudably, are committed to their goals in this war. So I'm not sure how we get out of this, right? And you point out rightly that the Western capitalist system doesn't look long-term, right? It's monthly goals, it's annual budgets, it's quarterly targets for defense industry, that sort of thing. It's for lawmakers, jobs in their district. I think there's some, because as you were talking about, why don't you just frame it as it's jobs? There's something about the Vietnam era where to say that making bombs is good for us, there's a problem in the public psyche with that. Because I'm wondering, like you, why wouldn't you go, hey, what are you complaining about? This is good for us, this war. But it's not something we say out loud, apparently, right? So I think that's another thing, while you're not seeing even the districts that would benefit talking about that overtly. It's probably being discussed at city council meetings and, behind closed doors. But this isn't something that the president is saying or whatever. It's all on the auspices of the morality piece, right? As you said, it's an eye roll in some sectors. It's like, okay, I got it. Ukraine good, Russia bad. I got it. However, we're draining our resources. We should be focused on education and infrastructure and collapsing bridges in the southern border. And so that logic, which you posit deftly, is kind of lost on the American public in general, right? So I have some concerns with respect to how this is going to play out.
The couple of things I would pitch in would be, first of all of these discussions and the discussion of Ukraine's 10-point peace plan, which, let's be honest, is the starting point as their ideal conditions in any negotiation. And they get what a lot of people have forgotten, which is that in a negotiation, you don't start asking for the negotiation by offering concessions. You go in with your starting position, and they go in with their starting position, and then you both have to make concessions to get to something acceptable.
That's a good point.
Because after all, the Russians their starting point is, well, everything we've got we keep, and you can't join NATO and you can't join any security guarantees with the West and you can't join the EU and you have to promise to, all of these things. You're like, okay, well, that will never happen either, in terms of no one could accept that on the Ukrainian side. So, both sides are starting with a starting position. But the key thing is this debate is constantly framed in the West by people who are both speaking with good intentions and plenty who aren't, as essentially being about convincing the Ukrainians to accept significant compromises in order to stop the war. That is not how wars between major states stop. That would be a correct line of interpretation if Ukraine was the one who attacked Russia, but that is not what's happening. And so, as you rightly say, Russia is gearing up to defeat. Their plan is to defeat Ukraine in 2025 or 26. They have put their economy on a war footing. They are gearing up for a mobilization economy, and they're saying it publicly. Like, you just go watch Russian TV, go watch the Duma proceedings. Like, you can see translated versions of it. They are telling you, it's right there, and it's not in code or anything. It's just saying it. Now, this is a country that has taken 300,000 plus casualties and killed and seriously wounded. It's about 200,000 at this stage. Now, they are not deterred by that. That is a very good indicator of their resolve. They are not going to be bought off by any commitments that we could, even with significant duress, ask Ukraine or force Ukraine to give up. All you would get is a 3 to 6 month pause, for which you would have to trade away all sorts of things, from operational initiative, through positions, through territorial integrity, through the entire unity of the Western alliance, the Ukrainian trust with Western leaders. All of that would have to be traded away to get a brief ceasefire, during which the Russians would simply do what they did in Syria repeatedly, what they did in Georgia, what they did in Chechnya, which is agree a ceasefire for just long enough to get fully set up for the next phase of offensive operations. So sort out all of their logistical difficulties, train up those new formations, get their supply situation fully sorted out, and concentrate on the axis that most suits them to go in terms of ground and logistics and concentration of resources, and then come straight back in 3 to 6 months' time. Because if they left Ukraine for longer than that, if they left Ukraine even 2 or 3, 1 year, 2 years, then that would have time for Ukrainian forces to be trained by NATO personnel, to get defense industry domestically set up again, to get to a position where they could be much, much more self-defense capable. But the Russians would be in a position within 3 months or 6 months at the latest to come back in with a devastating offensive where they would have all the initiative. You can't negotiate your way out of a war with an aggressor power that is still conducting offensive operations at scale, who believes they can win. They're not going to accept an end of the war because they think they can win. And the reason why a lot of countries and a lot of people and a lot of politicians and a lot of publics are talking about negotiations, i.e. forcing the Ukrainians to compromise to end the war, is because they are losing faith that Ukraine can win. So that is the opposite of an incentive for the Russians to stop the war. The Russians will keep going on the war unless they don't think they can win. So, what do people think that the Ukrainians could offer that would be better, more attractive to the Russian leadership, which, as you said, doesn't care about 300,000 casualties, more than 2,000 tanks? They're still committed. So in the face of that will, why do they think the Russians would stop? They think they can beat Ukraine. And currently, we are not doing enough to ensure that they can't. So the only way we get this war to stop, actually stop, short of just an incredibly costly ceasefire that lasts just long enough for the Russians to get in full prep and full position for a massive new offensive, the only way we get it to stop is by putting the investments in place to make support sustainable, so that Russia sees its long-term prospects in fighting, that's what they're thinking long-term, as getting worse over time, not better. Because only then will they have an incentive to stop. As you said, from our perspective, we think the casualties should be enough. that clearly the Russians must want to stop the war. We only need to give them an off ramp. We just need to get the Ukrainians to compromise enough, to give them an off ramp, and then we'll all stop. Because for us, any of our countries, 300,000 casualties, my God, of course we would want to pay almost anything to stop that. Except, actually, if you go back into our history, A, as I've just said, that doesn't apply to Russia. But B, if you look at our own history, it didn't apply to us either. So if you look at the European or Japanese wars, for example, in the Second World War, America had by that point taken well over 600, 700,000 casualties. But they, the allies as a whole, the UK and America for the most part, plus Canada and Australia and all of those allies, there were repeated attempts to negotiate a surrender, a ceasefire, an armistice by both the Nazi government and by Imperial Japan, long before we ever got to the unconditional surrenders. And we were willing, even after all of that devastation, to continue prosecuting the war with those hundreds of thousands of casualties to come, with all of that expenditure, because we thought we could win unconditionally and we saw the value to doing so. So we kept going. So we have to convince the Russians they can't win. The only way to do that, unfortunately, is to spend money like we're fighting a major power that is on a war footing, because that's what's happening, as unwelcome as it is. And of course, the final aspect of that is, if you force Ukraine into a disastrous compromise that buys them 3 months and then ruination in a new offensive with Russia holding all the cards suddenly, what message does that send to China or Russia for future deterrence? Because what you've just told them at that point is, we don't have the stomach for a major war. All you have to do is inflict enough economic pain, not even casualties, and economic pain on a minuscule scale compared to anything the Ukrainians are suffering or anything the US suffered in any previous wars. And we'll just give up because it's all a bit difficult. You are incentivizing future wars by forcing Ukraine, the discussion even, let alone actually withholding aid and forcing Ukraine to accept some compromise. And it won't stop the war anyway. All it will do is make it worse. Sadly, there is no cheap or good way out of this. Dictatorships and bullies only respond to force. So you have to convince them that force doesn't work, because we can meet and exceed it if we need to. Just as we did in the Cold War, just as we did, unfortunately, with such cost in previous hot wars. And as I said, it is so much cheaper to deter a war, to build enough force and enough capacity to deter a war, than it is to actually fight it.
I'm reminded of a Winston Churchill quote that America does the right thing after exhausting every other option. And so I'm afraid we might be in that position here. Dr. Justin Bronk, your perspective is the definition of deep intel, and it's great to see you again. And thanks for spending some time with us today.
My pleasure. See you next time.
And that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/Ward Carroll. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.